Well, hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Aaron Wilson. I'm the state climatologist of Ohio and assistant professor field specialist with OSU Extension, Ohio State University Extension. And on behalf of the North Central Climate Collaborative, NC3, I would like to welcome you to this special webinar called Unpacking the Agricultural and Water Aspects of the 5th National Climate Assessment across the North Central region. NC3 is made up of extension professionals, as you may know, from across the region who are working to increase the flow and usability of climate information for extension farmers, natural resource managers, and communities. The team's working to increase adoption of climate smart practices, improving water management, and all while maintaining profitability. Before we get started, there are a few logistical items I'd like to cover. To access the closed captioning, please find the box at the bottom of the screen labeled with CC. Click the box and select the show subtitles. This will allow you to view the subtitles during the presentation. During the webinar, please submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can get to at the conclusion of the speakers today. Chat's been disabled, so please use the Q&A if you have information to share with the organizers. There will be a quick 2-question survey, brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have time, please, we encourage you to take that. And you can always learn more about the North Central Climate Collaborative at northcentralclimate.org. So with that, let us go ahead and begin. As many of you or all of you know, the U.S. Global Change Research Program's 5th National Climate Assessment was released in November of 2023. Today, we've assembled authors from 4 of the chapters that are pertinent to our North Central region of the U.S. And we will get to those speakers here in just a moment. But a little bit of background about the National Climate Assessment here began as a presidential initiative in 1989, mandated by Congress, of course, through the Global Change Research Act. And really, it's about assisting the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. It's got a lot of infrastructure, a lot of federal oversight, subcommittee on global change research composed of the member agencies that you see here that make up the USGCRP member agency base. Again, it's legislative origins here with the National Climate Assessment. It's supposed to occur not less than every 4 years. And the USGCRP is responsible for preparing and submitting this report to the President and Congress. And it's meant to integrate, evaluate, and interpret the findings and discuss scientific uncertainties with such findings. I think that's really important to point out here, that it's high-level integration. And we also want to understand what are the uncertainties and the unknowns and gaps in our current knowledge over a vast variety and diverse set of topics related to climate. It analyzes the effects of global change on the natural environment, agriculture, transportation, biological diversity, human social systems, all of and many of the parts of human activity and life that we talk about here on Earth. And it's meant to analyze current trends in global change, both human-induced and natural variability, so understanding those trends and project those trends out to 25 to 100 years, which is pretty interesting. And I think collectively as an author group, we had a moment thinking about 100 years, hey, that takes us in the first part of the next century, right? And so just that realization that we're really talking about projecting climate well into that next century here. So again, it's an evaluation of the body of scientific or technical knowledge. It's about synthesizing that knowledge in a way and applying our best professional judgment to bridge uncertainties. And the process of coming to a consensus-based view among all of our chapters, I found as an author with the Midwest chapter, kind of the beauty and the magic of it, and just trying to understand that, in about anywhere from 5 to 10,000 words, we can't talk about everything that impacts our region or our topic, but we have to come together with some consensus-based view of the state of the science over what we do cover. It's not meant to be policy prescriptive, but it is relevant for policy. And of course, be authoritative, timely, and transparent. And I think another good aspect of the whole report is the beauty in terms of the traceable accounts and how we came to our consensus-based view, which I encourage readers to check out. These are the NCA chapters. Many of the chapters are familiar with this process. The other thing to think about is that these NCA reports build upon the previous reports. I don't think we should look at these as one-offs or individuals, but we're building on this legacy and this history of describing and evaluating climate change and impacts across our lifetime here in terms of these reports when they started. So you can look at the different aspects here. A lot of attention paid to social justice, making sure it's as inclusive as possible to all of our peoples across the entire country. Thinking about some of the compound events. Obviously, this all developed during COVID-19 and it even has its own focus box and a lot of new chapters as well. So I really encourage you to check that out. And again, for our North Central region that covers areas of the Midwest, the Northern Great Plains, as well as the Southern Great Plains chapter, which are 3 of our chapters presented today, along with the agricultural and national topic sector chapter today. Real briefly, the timeline really crunched a bit this time, but considering that everything came together to become established in February of 2020 to the spring of 2021, and then all of those drafts and reviews, 7 rounds of reviews, public and national academies reviews, federal agency reviews, till we finally finalized and published the living online document there in November of 2023. So quite something, and it's been great to be a part of. The other key thing that you'll find in this report is art and art really distributed throughout it in all of its chapters to bring together kind of a visual as we all work and kind of hit different aspects of climate work in our daily lives. A lot of us feel, through art, we can, it becomes a little bit more accessible, a way of expressing those changes that we're seeing across the landscape. And this is an interesting selection that was chosen for the Midwest chapter called Ice Burst in a Ghost Marsh. Thinking about the changing landscape of that winter landscape across the upper Midwest and what that means for everything living and existing there on its surface. So I would really encourage you to take some time with the art of the National Climate Assessment as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to turn it over now to our first guest speaker. This is Sir Ray Wolf. Ray retired in 2022 as the Science and Operations Officer for NOAA's National Weather Service in Davenport, Iowa. He was responsible for managing operations, staff training, and local research. Ray was an author on the National Climate Assessment version 5 in our Midwest chapter, and it's a pleasure to introduce him here today. So Ray, you ready to take it over?
Thanks, Aaron. And for folks not familiar with the Weather Service, my job actually is pretty much like an extension position for our local office and the folks we serve. And I've worked with ag folks my entire career, so I'm channeling my extensionness, if that's a word. I want to thank Aaron. I actually worked from his slide set to put this together, which saved me a lot of time. I also want to acknowledge the folks on the team for the Midwest chapter. It was a great group of people, very diverse, and especially in terms of background, some from the academic community, some more service focused, some from NGOs, and a tribal representative as well. And that's important, I think, for developing a well-rounded chapter. So the basic theme here I highlighted in bold and italics really comes down to increasing temperatures and oscillations between extremes of droughts and flood. It's pervasive through so much in the Midwest: agriculture, ecosystems, communities and individuals, transportation or built infrastructure and whatnot. That's really the driving climate factor behind our chapter. And if we take a look at what we've observed here, we have in the graphic there, temperature on the left and precipitation on the right, we've seen in the Midwest, both annually and to a degree seasonally, increase in temperatures, especially the upper Midwest and Great Lakes, uh, been amplified relative to other parts of the Midwest. And we also see that the warmth has been most noted in the winter season, and interestingly, not quite as much in the summer season. There's it's referred to as a warming hole. The physical reasoning for why that exists remains yet to be fully defined. There are a lot of ideas out there. From an agricultural perspective, one of those things might be the influence of well-watered crops on keeping temperatures down during the summer, but there might be other climate dynamic aspects at play as well. We also see annually that the entire region is trending wetter. Uh, that is across all seasons, especially though winter and spring. And the spring wetness can be especially problematic for agriculture uh, when soils are bare pre-plant before canopies developed in relations to erosion, soil erosion, and nutrient runoff. We'll talk a little bit more about that down the line too. So some of the things we've seen in terms of extremes in the upper left in temperature, interesting, not so much in terms of hot days during the summertime as you might sort of intuitively infer from a warming climate. But we have had in the middle there a decrease in the number of cold days during the winter time. And I know this past winter across much of the Midwest was a good example of that. But a more subtle signature, and that's important for agriculture, is an increase in the number of warm nights during the warm season. And this has implications for plant growth and development, increase in respiration at night, and accelerating phenological development, which can both act as yield reducers. But when I give talks here in the area, I emphasize that although people hear, global climate warming and temperature change, it's really the water side of the equation is very significant in our area as well. And the graphic on the bottom right is three different measures of heavy precipitation. The first one there reflects the increase in heavy precipitation if we take the top 1% of events, of daily events, and look at how that has changed over time. We've seen a substantial increase, not only in the Midwest, but also in the Northeast part of the country. So we are getting more rain, but we're also getting more rain in heavier events. And there are other ways to look at it, but the two graphics there on the right, the 5-year maximum daily precipitation and the annual maximum daily precipitation are also showing increases. So we're slicing and dicing the same data, basically just looking at it from a little bit of a different angle, but we see the same theme uh, all the way through. And we know, again, to circle back to the issue with soil erosion and some other farm related issues, that most of the erosion that occurs with a few heaviest rain events that occur during the spring that can account for most of the soil and nutrient runoff. So that begs the question, if that's what we've seen so far, where are we heading? And these two maps kind of reflect the response in temperature to a 2 degrees Celsius global warming level through about mid-century on the left there. And again, we see the same warming signal of a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, especially amplified over the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. And on the right there, we see the projections also indicating a continuation of the trends toward a wetter environment. So, insofar as water impacts everything, that's a big driver in our area. But interestingly, one of the things, and this is a great paper by Trent Ford and one of his cohorts at the University of Illinois, are the change in frequency of transitions between 1 month extremes. And that would be like 1 month being extremely wet and then falling into the next month being extremely dry, or vice versa. And those transitions can be very challenging for aspects of agriculture. And kind of the analog that we use, at least here in the heart of the Corn Belt, was 2019, where we had the major, if not historic, flood on the Mississippi River due to a wet winter and a very wet spring and substantial runoff. But if folks remember, by later in the summer, we were dealing with drought, and flipping from one extreme to another sort of invokes the concept of weather whiplash, uh, and that can be challenging to deal from an agricultural perspective. There's an analog year. I remember going back to 1983 when we had a particularly wet spring. It didn't influence planting too much. The crop got off to what looked to be a pretty good start, but then it turned very hot, and there ended up being some reductions to yield due to drought. And when they went back and studied the root development of the plants in fields that year, they found that the roots were reasonably well developed in the first 2 feet of the soil profile. But even though there was moisture between 3 and 5 feet down, the hot weather stressed the plant such that the root development could not tap that. So you start running into challenges when you're flipping from one extreme to another. So, key messages, we had 5 sections in our chapter. The fifth one is related to water directly, and that's climate change related risks to water quantity and quality are increasing risks. Again, to ecosystem health, food production, agriculture, surface and groundwater, and recreation. So these occurrences of droughts and floods and whatnot are anticipated to be very impactful in a number of ways. I've mentioned an erosion already, harmful algal blooms, expansion of invasive species. To be sure, the existence of an invasive species is not a climate change issue per se, but what the range of that invasive species is influenced by climate change. And to keep a positive spin, I've noticed giving talks, it's easy to fall into the vortex of negativity, but it's important that realize there are things going on between federal, state agencies, and NGOs to help improve adaptation efforts to address these issues. In the upper right, we see some projections of runoff, and depending on the scenario, the degree of runoff varies. We see more runoff actually in a very high scenario, but the seasonality of the runoff is very interesting. A lot more runoff projected into winter and the spring, and this brings forward questions about fall applications of nitrogen and winter applications of manure, where those take place, and how that's going to work through the system. We also see in the summer not much of a signal in runoff at all, which is suggestive of potential increase in drought frequency. In the lower left is actually summer season soil moisture from the models. And the two little thumbnails there indicate the wettest 20% models showing soil moisture increasing, and the driest 20% of the model showing uh, decrease in soil moisture. And there's a couple of ways to interpret this model variability. The most straightforward way is it might have to do with the internal workings of the model, and especially is how the climate dynamics interact with the land surface. That's certainly a part of it, and probably a significant part of it. It might also indicate the sensitivity of the system to external forcing from climate change, in that subtle tips in one direction or another can have significant output uh, in terms of what the ultimate uh, answer is. And part of the equation is, as we warm, the demand for water from the plants, the evapotranspiration, is going to increase. So we're balancing that increase in evapotranspiration with increases of precipitation. And while algebraically the math seems pretty simple, within the construct of the model, it can be pretty challenging. We included a map of US aquifers here to show that what happens in a local level to water quality and quantity really depends on where their water source is. We saw in the 2012 drought over northern Missouri and southern Iowa, in areas that depend heavily on surface water, that they were very exposed to impacts from the drought. In contrast, areas that, especially that tap deep aquifers, are a little more resilient in that manner. But it's a very complex issue, because you run into issues with shallow aquifers, like we've seen in the driftless area in southeast Minnesota, northeast Iowa, southwest Wisconsin, that nutrients and other pollutants can more easily get into the shallow aquifers in areas with that karst geography, and that can become problematic. And there are also competition between municipal water uses and water uses for agriculture, not so much in irrigation, because irrigation in general is not a huge thing in the Midwest, but water use for production of food uh, is, and that can put strains even on deep water aquifers, uh, as we've seen with the Jordan Aquifer in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. So, where your water comes from is an important filter for how vulnerable one is to drought impacts. I included this picture. This is actually from the ecology part of the chapter, and it's a great summary picture of what sorts of things can be done to the landscape. And we'll get into some of the climate smart stuff in agriculture in a little bit, but the conservation, tillage, and in cover crops. But you see a lot of the things that can help mitigate not only the high water flows, but also the low water flows, is to, in short, return rivers and streams closer to what they were originally like, tight floodplains back into the rivers, stream flow restoration, inclusion of riparian buffers to help moderate uh, nutrients in urban areas, reducing impervious surfaces to allow water to flow through down into the soil through interflow and into the water table. So there are some things that can be done. The challenge is to do them on a landscape scale and have impact on the important rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the lower Missouri. So for agriculture specifically, stated there, crop production is projected to change in complex ways due to the extreme precipitation events and the transitions between wet and dry. as well as the increase in evapotranspiration or crop water use. There are changes in snow season that are underway. Areas in the southern part of the Midwest are seeing less snow. Uh, Ironically, areas farther north might be seeing more snow at times because winter storms are more moist than they were in the past. So if you're cold enough to get snow, the potential to get extreme snowfall is increasing, at least up to the point where it becomes warm enough and we're seeing more rain events instead of snow. For It's not just a crop issue; it also gets into animal agriculture. The increase in pest and disease transmission coming from areas to the south having a weed and disease profile that uh, might be more common farther south becomes more likely as we continue to warm. Muddier pastures and pressure on water quality. We know with increased runoff, water quality tends to decrease. So the hope is that climate smart agriculture and some other adaptation techniques uh, help move us forward in an environmental sense. But one of the points made in the report is that that's largely a situation that remains to be defined as to how effective those techniques are having. And this graphic here, figure 24.4, showing the climate smart strategies. The idea is to be able to maintain agricultural productivity, but at the same time uh, decrease the negative environmental impacts, through things like cover crop usage, reduce or no tillage, better manure management, water management, uh, runoff management, and whatnot. A pretty heavy list there. But it's not all focused around the carbon related aspects in agriculture. There's also changes we've seen in the freeze climatology. We know the growing season is getting longer at both ends in the spring uh, and the fall. Uh, the problem in the spring with the earlier freezes we saw in 2007, we had a huge warm up in March that pushed phenology of a lot of the specialty crops very quick into the growing season. And then we had a record cold event the first week of April that ended up resulting in about $2 billion worth of damage across the southeastern portion uh, of the US, a very significant freeze event that was set up by the warm weather proceedings. So that's one of the concerns. So as I wrap up here, I want to just at least give mention to the other parts of the chapter on ecosystems. Of course, agriculture in itself is an ecosystem. So as you imagine impacts on the ag ecosystem, likewise on the natural ecosystem, there are impacts as well. One of the other things we addressed in the chapter was impacts on individual and community health, not only physical health, but also mental health aspects. A lot of work, heat health warning systems, I know going on in Weather Service and NOAA as well. And last section I want to mention is the infrastructure, the built environment, and how there are things available that can help mitigate, especially from heat, and those are elucidated in more detail in the chapter. And I think with that, Aaron, I will stop sharing and pass control on to Tanya.
All right. Thank you so much, Ray, for that glimpse at the Midwest chapter. I really appreciate it. We're going to transition now to the Northern Great Plains, and I would like to introduce Dr. Tanya Haig, who is a research assistant professor and social science coordinator of the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research focuses on adaptive capacity of agricultural producers and others to cope with drought. And she's not a stranger to webinars here with the North Central Climate Collaborative. So Tanya, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I was one of the authors for the Northern Great Plains chapter. The Northern Great Plains, we included a handy little map, includes Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. Overall, what I'm going to be talking about, this region's known for its variability in climate extremes anyway. We're seeing that intensifying with climate change. And then I'm really going to talk a lot about how our region's been impacted and is responding, and the way that that's happening here, how that's influenced really by our low population, our very rural and remote typology, our dependence on natural resources, and our region's status really as an exporter of resources, which makes us open to influence from external markets and policies, really. So the first key message, our chapter also has 5 key messages. The first key message really focuses on climate change compounding the impacts of extreme events. Ray, I'm glad you spent a lot more time really diving into the physical aspects of climate change, because I'm not going to so much. Really, for this region, I'm just going to say really we're experiencing unprecedented extremes already, including severe droughts, increases in hail frequency and size, floods, unprecedented floods, and wildfires. And what we're seeing is that rising temperatures across the region are expected to lead to increased evapotranspiration, as well as greater variability in precipitation, and some of those being some factors that are driving the impacts that we're expecting to see. So I'm going to walk through the rest of our key messages. Some are more agricultural and water focused than others, but they all really relate to how climate change is affecting people in the Northern Great Plains. So the key message 2 describes impacts to human and ecological health. And really just very briefly, you can see in the key message that climate-related hazards are already harming the physical, mental, and spiritual health of residents in the Northern Great Plains, as well as the ecology of the region. And the figure that I chose to include here is an indication of the ecological health of our region being indicated by invasive species, which Ray also brought up as already increasing in the region, and then what we're expecting to see in the future. So we do expect increasing and cascading negative impacts on human health, as well as on our lands, waters, and the species that people depend on in this region. Our third key message is the key message that I spent more time working on, so I'll talk a little bit more about this key message. This relates to resource and land-based livelihoods and how these livelihoods have been at risk. So of course, the Northern Great Plains region heavily reliant on agriculture and on resource-based economies in general. So our livelihoods are at risk from the impacts of climate change, as well as related policy, and I'll kind of get a little bit to that as well. And I'm going to break it down by sector and show each one of these maps individually. So agriculture, what we expect for agriculture and recreation are that we'll probably see some positive effects, but primarily negative effects related to changing temperature and precipitation regimes. You can, on the slide, you can see crop production. We're expecting crop production to have some benefits from a longer growing season, but then also that increased heat and moisture stress in the summer being a problem. We did want to try to display in this graphic kind of this range of row cropping land, agricultural land, as well as pasture land. So the more tan colors are more pasture or grass-based, the more green is more row crops or agriculture. Rangeland productivity in this area has been fairly resilient and may actually see less effect from climate change than other livestock producing regions, for example, that Renee might be talking about in the Southern Plains. But we're also seeing a continued creep of row crops into more traditional pasture land areas, which is leading to increased vulnerability of those areas to climate change stresses. So then briefly, I also wanted to talk about recreation, which is very important to livelihoods in this region as well, and has connection to water management. Many water-based activities are both vulnerable to drought, but are also part of in contributing to conflicts with other water uses where water is scarce during drought, or just under increasing water scarcity. We have seen some evidence of winter sports seasons decreasing, but the same areas being offset by increases in spring and autumn. So the shoulder season recreational activities, including wildlife-based activities. Briefly, maybe marginal to agriculture and water, but really important to this area are energy sector livelihoods. And so the map that you see here are locations of major energy harvest in the region. So you can see how predominant that really is in our region. We've got active oil and gas wells, coal mines, as well as an increasing number of wind turbine installations. So we're an energy-rich region. We are net energy exporters for the most part to the rest of the country. This energy revenue creates risk in the region, stemming both from short-term revenue volatility, but also long-term dependence on these revenue sources that I'll bring up again as being a cause to really some of the tensions in this region. But as you can see with the wind turbine installations, really the clean energy or green energy is really starting to shift some of those energy livelihoods in the region as well. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about just community infrastructure and quality of life in the region. So what our key message says is that climate change is testing the adaptive capacity of our region's resilience, especially the rural. Again, we're highly rural, indigenous communities and low income immigrant populations are really being affected by climate extremes in this region. So the map that you see here, the shades of pink are the social vulnerability index that some of you may be familiar with as the Susan Cutter product. So you can see the darker pink being highly vulnerable compared to the lighter pink. And then the letters on this map, you can go to the chapter and read about some of the communities that are being affected. And so, for example, point A, so after the 2019 historic Nebraska floods in the spring of 2019, we saw community level impacts ranging from damage to home, lack of water and sanitation services, increased levels of anxiety and stress, going back to that mental health impacts. In that same region are the Santee Sioux tribe, and who experienced interruption to both power and drinking water supplies in the region, wastewater backups, and destruction of many bridges and buildings. This community is not alone. These 5 communities are not alone. That's just what we focused on. And one thing that we're seeing is that a lack of resilient infrastructure had really been creating ongoing water insecurity in some areas, particularly in indigenous communities. So in addition, we highlight that we have a higher percentage of mobile homes in our region than the national average, which are, of course, very vulnerable to environmental disasters. So overall, if you look at all these maps together, I think you really see how the overlap of natural resources and land use as kind of overlaid with the social vulnerability is really leading to some complex tensions and trade-offs in our region. And that was the basis of our key message 4. So these tensions and trade-offs in what we're producing and our climate vulnerability are really underlying some difficult decisions that we have before us in terms of how to best manage water quantity and quality, how to balance trade-offs between consumptive and ecological uses of water. We have seen that while decision makers may be increasingly aware of climate-related problems and communities are obviously being affected, there are still many cultural and structural and institutional barriers that are preventing really effective mitigation and adaptation actions in our region. We document some examples of states in the region who are relying on fossil fuel economies, really creating resistance to an energy transition and economic diversification. We also document some barriers, including less research funding than other regions, lowered capacity to adapt in communities, a generally not welcome perception of the existence of climate change in this region, as well as a confusing and sometimes contradictory set of water regulations and rights around surface water storage. So these factors we're seeing as really limiting some of the transition planning and community level resilience building that may need to happen in this region. But like Ray, I wanted to also have some positive. And nonetheless, adaptation is underway in the Northern Great Plains. And I wanted to highlight one of the things our chapter tried to do because of, I should have showed this pointed it out on the other maps. We tried to highlight all of the tribal communities, tribal lands in our region, and they're extensive. So our chapter really highlighted and integrated the traditional knowledge and philosophy that we're learning from, particularly in this area of adaptation and transformation. So I wanted to share a couple of examples. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe has several really good initiatives in progress to build resilience to climate change. They have a tribal climate adaptation plan, and the plan incorporates Lakota philosophy and traditional knowledge. It incorporates information about historical migrations, astronomy, origin stories, and the tribe's relationship with the buffalo. The plan prioritizes tribal data sovereignty, collaboration between departments, and also directly supports tribal households to prepare. In addition, and that's in South Dakota, in addition, the Blackfeet Nation located in Montana have also recently completed a climate adaptation plan. And that includes all of the natural resource departments across the tribal government. And what they found was that taking a very inclusive approach, it took more time and coordination, but they feel like it really created a lot of opportunities for collaboration. So there are strategies such as a project to protect beaver in the area, to restore rivers, and to increase natural water storage, which is one of the strategies that Ray raised, actually, to reduce vulnerability to drought and flooding, as well as natural resource departments partnering directly with community college students on research projects, which I thought was really cool. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight the National Park Service, obviously really important partner in our area, who have adopted scenario-based planning to help managers and others try to start thinking about the uncertainty and ways that things that might change in the future, things that they may have to address in the future. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with scenario-based planning. Works with a set of plausible futures that capture a broad range of future conditions. So here they've looked at everything from very dry and droughty, frequent droughts, generally drier and a bit wetter, and then tried to identify potential outcomes of those scenarios and best ways to manage. And I'm going to wrap up with that. I also really want to give props to the chapter team for this chapter. Years of work in gathering, reviewing, discussing, integrating all of a really broad set of information. And here's our recommended chapter citation, and you can read the full chapter. So thanks, and I'll turn it over.
All right, thank you, Tanya. So rich in topics and complexity, really came through in your presentation there. So really appreciate that. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Renee McPherson, who's Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Oklahoma, and also the University Director of the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Renee was the lead author of the Southern Great Plains chapter, which is where we'll turn now. We all love our boundaries and how we delineate different boundaries across the region, but we certainly share in all of these topics. So Renee, I appreciate you being here today to share your chapter. Thank you.
Certainly, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to share. I think a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today are overlap very nicely with what you've already heard. So I'll be focusing on the Southern Great Plains, but mostly on the portions that are in Kansas and Oklahoma, and then the tribes across our region. And my wonderful author team is the brain power behind both the content, but also the structure of our chapter. So as Ray talked about, and you also heard from Tanya, we've got some changes that we've seen in our climate, and the Southern Great Plains maybe has seen fewer large-scale impacts of climate change than other regions because of its relatively low latitude, flat terrain, and high climate variability. Still, our average temperatures are increasing, and annual precipitation has increased across most of the region, mostly from heavier summer rains. Some of our extreme events are becoming more frequent or intense. So, for example, the annual number of days with 2 or more inches of precipitation has increased, especially in the eastern part of our region. Our future temperatures are expected to be historically unprecedented as early as mid-century. We project more extremely hot days, fewer extremely cold days, and more intense drought conditions as we go into the future. More precipitation is projected near the region's northern and eastern boundaries, especially by the century's end, whereas slightly drier future conditions are expected elsewhere. The changing climate conditions are expected to influence how we live, how we work, play, heal inequities, and serve residents. And those form our 5 key messages centering around these themes. So climate change is starting to affect how we live. We expect more people to suffer from climate extremes and events. Rangeland health is being degraded by woody plant encroachment from precipitation changes or fire suppression. Wetlands are suffering from high evaporation rates or excess nutrient inputs from flood runoff. Warming temperatures are expanding the ranges and lengthening the active seasons of ticks, mosquitoes, and other disease vectors that really affect agricultural workers and other outdoor workers. For instance, ticks continued to seek hosts across eastern Kansas and Oklahoma in the winter of 2017, when temperatures were quite warm. Traditions, heritage, and culture related to land and water are also at risk because of changes forced by novel climate conditions. Culturally significant species are shifting in range, making them absent or rare on lands where indigenous peoples have access. Through the Indian Removal Act and treaties with the US, tribes have become geographically fixed in certain areas, often where they are more exposed to climate hazards than their historical lands. As a result, indigenous foods, waters, and traditions that bind them, and those traditions that bind them together are at higher risk from climate change. For example, warming temperatures are shifting ranges of culturally significant species. Tribes are, though, moving ahead to try to revive some of their cultural practices and their relationships with nature to find solutions that resonate with these traditions and their worldviews. For example, the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators is building on indigenous cultural and medicinal traditions to preserve and restore grassland ecosystems for monarch butterflies and other threatened pollinators. Community food forests, such as the Osage Orchard in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, provide food sovereignty and security, climate resilience, and public health benefits. To address the growing risks, each of our key messages outlines an example climate driver. Here, drought, that the impacts that climate driver has, and then the actions that people can take to be more climate resilient. So for example, here we have more frequent or severe droughts, can cause water shortages. Communities can prepare by replacing leaking pipes, implementing water reuse, and developing drought plans. Our second message, climate change is affecting how we work. Our businesses and industries are experiencing disruptions and economic losses as a result of climate change, but there are also new economic opportunities for those who look for them. Hotter temperatures, heavier rainfall, stronger tropical cyclones, and other climate changes have harmed workers' health and productivity, disrupted supply chains, inflated costs, increased insurance costs, and shifted customer demand. Ag producers are losing livestock crops and income as climate extremes increase in magnitude and frequency. High temperatures have reduced plant growth, diminished crop productivity, and pose risks to animal health. Drought has reduced the capacity of native rangelands and planted pastures to support livestock. Hot, dry wind events have increased in southwest Kansas and the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas, and these have caused losses in wheat yields. In the future, plant hardiness zones are predicted to continue migrating northward as our winters warm. Longer growing seasons also can disrupt the historical connection between plants and their pollinators, or between insects and their predators. Across northern parts of the region, you heard Ray talk about this some, that combination of cold fronts and earlier springs is projected to increase the potential for plant damage because bud burst occurs before the last freeze. The risk of these late fall spring events is projected to increase by up to 20% in northern parts of our region. Climate change is also affecting how we play. Climate extremes are affecting our participation in outdoor sport, recreation, and leisure activities, including water-related recreation. However, adaptations can be made to reduce climate risk and increase positive health outcomes for all people. Lakes, streams, and reservoirs support fishing, hunting, and other outdoor recreation. However, more variable or heavier rainfall, droughts, and higher temperatures have jeopardized these activities. In 2019, Tanya mentioned the flooding in Nebraska. That had continued also in southeast Kansas and northeast Oklahoma, where they experienced historic spring flooding after nearly 2 feet of rain fell. The Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism sustained more than $12 million in damages, mostly through lost revenues from park closures. Extreme heat is the most likely and dangerous threat to outdoor activities in the future. Heat injuries can damage organs or disrupt the central nervous system. Future increases in the number of very hot days and warm nights are expected to worsen health concerns. By the end of the century, under a very high scenario, the number of 100-degree days is projected to increase by 30 to 60 days annually across Kansas and Oklahoma. Climate change is also stressing how we heal inequities across our region. As you've heard, some people and places are suffering disproportionately from climate-related hazards because of historical marginalization or discrimination, as well as inadequate attention to equity in policymaking. Without significant attention to these inequities, climate change will worsen the burdens on those with the fewest resources to prepare and adapt. So as we look at mitigation and adaptation solutions, it's really helpful to place an equity and justice lens on all decision-making. Many under-resourced tribes and communities are working together to build resilient and thriving communities in the face of climate change. For example, 9 tribes of Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa have been applying their traditional knowledges and experiences to develop their own climate adaptation plans. Climate change is impacting how we serve residents. The efficiency, effectiveness, and equitable distribution of public services are being affected by more frequent and intense weather events. When systems fail, there are more, the impacts are more devastating for people living in under-resourced neighborhoods. So without significant adaptation, we expect that climate change will strain public infrastructure and services, including water services and sanitation services in the decades to come. Departments within cities and tribes are taking action. So for example, the public water utilities of the city of Norman have started to operate facilities using renewable energy. They also have begun to supplement water supplies that are required during drought conditions by transferring reclaimed water to their nearby reservoir for future use. Across our region, large cities have developed sustainability or climate action plans, but even smaller communities that lack resources for standalone climate plans are integrating climate actions into their hazard mitigation or comprehensive plans for community development. And I'll end by saying that the scale, scope, and pace of climate mitigation and adaptation throughout the Southern Great Plains has been too small for us to be resilient to what we expect in future decades. Actions need to be transformative and use an equity and justice lens to ensure that we don't leave our most under-resourced communities behind. Investments in systemic planning and implementation are expected to pay off in the future by reducing the costs and disruptions that otherwise will occur during extreme events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee. That was fantastic. And I think it's clear we're starting to see these common themes that were highlighted and brought forth by each of the individual chapters that are pertinent to the North Central region. And to sort of cap us off now and maybe get a little even more broader, we're happy to introduce Dr. Donnell Peck, who's the director of the Northern Plains Climate Hub with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Colorado. The Climate Hubs, as many of you know, connect agricultural producers and service providers with science-based resources and partnerships that enable climate-smart decisions in farming, ranching, and forestry across the country. Donnell was the co-author on the Chapter 11, or the Agriculture, Food Systems, in Rural Communities. And with that, I'd like to welcome Donnell to the floor. Thank you, Donnell.
Thank you, Aaron. Before I jump into our chapter, just again, acknowledgement of a brilliant team of co-authors and leadership listed here for this particular chapter. So our chapter has 3 key messages. I won't delve into each of them deeply. Suffice it to say, we'll spend a little bit of time today talking about key message 1, which is around agricultural adaptation in order to increase resilience in this changing landscape. Key message 2 touches on the broader food system, and that's something new for the National Climate Assessment. This is the first time that a chapter title has explicitly acknowledged the food system as opposed to just food production. So we'll touch a little bit on things beyond the farm gate, the rest of the food system. And then key message 3 is around our rural communities. We'll describe some of the impacts and experiences that they are facing in a changing climate, knowing that they manage a lot of our nation's working lands and natural resources. They have unique knowledge of that landscape, and they supply a lot of labor, not just to agriculture, but to other economic sectors. So those are the 3 key messages that you'll find in this chapter, and of course encourage you to dive in and take a closer look, because we only have so much time today. Thankfully, Renee is going to save us a little bit of time here because she already touched on one of our figures from chapter 11, and that's the plant hardiness zones. Already heard the plant hardiness zones are expected to shift northward, and so the only thing I'll add here is just for where I live in the Northern Plains region, and this spills over into the Midwest too, that currently you see a lot of purple shades in our regions. Again, the Northern Plains and the Midwest, those purple shades represent plant hardiness zones kind of in the 3 to 4 range. And as we move across the screen into mid-century and then end of century, if we were to end up on a high emission scenario, this 8.5 scenario, those purples really start shifting more into the blues. So zones where we're currently in the 3s and 4s, by the end of the century, even middle century, a lot of those are blues, which are regions 5 and 6. Now, I'm a gardener. I love growing things. So this might seem like maybe a positive, right? That our growing season might be lengthened, or our minimum temperatures might not be so extreme. But as you've already heard from some of the other speakers, warmer temperatures come with a lot of other challenges, unfortunately. So this is another figure from our chapter. Across the top, that top row, you see several icons. Those icons represent a wide variety of extreme events that other chapters in the National Climate Assessment show are being fueled by climate change. So we know that these events already happen, but climate change is fueling them to become either more extreme or more frequent, depending on which type of event we're talking about. Climate change also brings these challenges, and the rest of this figure walks us through some examples of how those challenges affect our food supply chain or our food system. So starting on the left with production, you've already heard from our other speakers some of the challenges that production agriculture is already facing and will continue to face to even more extreme degrees in the future. And so I'm going to try and touch a little bit more later on the rest of the food system. But for now, again, knowing this is an agricultural audience, we'll focus our attention here kind of in the production sector for a few more minutes. We've heard a lot about increasing temperatures, and I think in the Southern Plains in particular, we heard a lot about increases in the number of unsafe heat days out there. And so in the world of production, this of course makes us think of our farm workers, our farm managers, folks, anybody that is working outdoors. And there is a study that has indicated that we expect the number of unsafe working days for anyone working outdoors to double by mid-century. And that's not just under the high emission scenario, that's also under the medium emission scenario, which are very plausible for the future. So think about when you spend time outdoors, whether it's because you work there or you play there, think of a doubling of the number of days where it's actually unsafe, unhealthy to be out there. And then think of our farm workers and our farm managers who are out there in those conditions trying to provide our food supply. One other example I'll just share here, getting us to think about how these impacts can ripple through our food supply chain. So let's think about in the world of production, if there is, again, more unsafe working days or more drought, This is going to reduce the number of hours that our farm workers can be out there. It's going to reduce their productivity. A drought might reduce demand for that labor. And how that can ripple across the supply chain is not just a reduction in our food supply, but also an impact on those farm workers as consumers, all the way over on the other end of the food supply chain. Our farm workers are also food consumers, as we are. And so if heat and drought or other disasters are reducing their ability to work, their ability to earn a living, then as consumers, they also face less income and increased food insecurity. So that's just one example of kind of the effects of climate change rippling through, or you might hear people call it compounding effects or cascading effects. We talk a lot about that throughout our chapter and in other chapters too. Okay, I'm an economist by training, and so I just wanted to point out some of the common ways we measure the economic impact of climate change on agriculture and food. The first one has already been highlighted. I think it was in the Midwest chapter that observed impacts, these are not projected, these are already happening, that temperature increases observed over the last roughly 20 years, the temperature increases that can be attributed to climate change have been tied to 19% of insured crop indemnities. And those are payments that farmers receive, farmers who have their crops insured, the payments they receive when that crop fails due to a covered cause of loss like drought or floods. And so almost 20% of the losses that they are experiencing in insured crops are attributable to climate change. Another common measure is something called total factor productivity, or just productivity. This is just a sense for how much output are we getting for all of the inputs that we put into our agricultural production. And we want more output for less input, right? We want that total factor productivity to be high and to be growing. And it has been growing in the US by about 1.4% per year. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but over time, that really adds up. So we've enjoyed steady growth in our productivity. Again, outputs have been going up faster than the need for inputs. And that's largely due to technology improvements and innovation. Unfortunately, climate change has dampened that growth. It's still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it would if climate change weren't happening. So climate change has slowed that growth, hasn't reversed it yet, but it's slowed it by about 12% over the last 50 years. And the challenge with that, it's great that it's still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it should. And eventually, if we don't do something about that, that's going to catch up with us, and that growth is actually going to start declining. And so there are studies that suggest that we need to double our rates of innovation and adaptation. Our current rates need to double in order to keep up with the pace of climate change and prevent our productivity from actually starting to decline. So a call for innovation and adaptation and uptake of all the great advancements we've made in agriculture in the US. On that note, because again, our productivity does continue to grow, maybe not as fast as we want it to, but because that productivity is growing and because our population continues to grow, when we take the total amount of emissions from the agriculture and food sectors, and we divide them by that growth or divide them by our population, our agricultural emissions per person in agriculture or per unit of productivity, those emissions have gone down, right? Those technology and innovations are helping us produce the same bite of food with fewer emissions. And that's wonderful. That's great. We need to keep driving those per unit emissions down. Unfortunately, one measure, the total amount of emissions from agriculture and food, that has continued to creep up. That's that brown line at the top. So our total emissions from agriculture have continued to creep up in total. And so again, a call for continued innovation, increased adaptation and uptake, innovating in ways that allow us to drive that other measure, that top measure, that brown line. Let's try and get that below the zero. Let's try and get total emissions in agriculture down while still feeding everyone, providing nutritious, affordable food. That's the challenge. Our chapter talks about different ways of achieving this, and something I really enjoyed about key message 1 is that they worked really hard to come up with a definition for what they call agroecological approaches. There's lots of definitions about agroecology out there, but this group wanted to come up with their own definition, and that is agroecology as a broad, fundamentally scientific concept that uses ecological principles to design and manage ag systems in a sustainable way. So that's the broad definition. You can go to the chapter and there's a pop-out box that talks a lot more about this definition. But what's nice, I think, and important is that this definition of agroecological approaches is big enough to be inclusive of a lot of different approaches. It's not prescriptive. The practices that can fall within this agroecological framework, they can include nature-based solutions, precision technologies, climate smart practices, again, that are trying to balance the need for food production with achieving positive environmental and economic outcomes as well. Of course, soils are at the foundation of this. Healthy soils are key to trying to achieve these goals. And these agroecological approaches, those that can improve soil health, are definitely increasingly recognized as being necessary to help maintain our farm productivity while also achieving a healthier environment and a more resilient society. So just a nod to our soils that are so critical. Back to our diagram, we talked about production. Now I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the rest of the food system: food storage, processing, retailing, marketing, consumption, and onward. And so just to help getting us to think creatively about how climate change is affecting the rest of our food system and our food supply chains. A quick example, we've heard a couple of times now about flooding events in our regions. And so imagine that there is an extreme flooding event and it knocks out roads and electricity in your local community. There's your local grocery store. They've lost electricity, maybe their generator isn't working or they didn't have one. And so now the food that they do have at the store is at risk of going bad, right? Whether that's fresh food or frozen food, there's now this risk of food spoiling. So the store would love if their workers could get there and help deal with this emergency to reduce the amount of food that spoils. But those workers are likely stuck at home dealing with their own emergencies. And so the grocery store doesn't have as many workers as it needs to respond to this crisis situation. For any consumers who can get to the store, maybe there's something really essential that they need. If they can get there, how do they buy the food? If you're like me, I'm usually just carrying my credit card, my debit card. I very rarely have cash or my checkbook on me. And so those consumers might get to the store and find the food that they want and want to purchase it so it doesn't spoil, but maybe they're not actually able to pay for it. And the store might not have a backup plan for that situation. So the food is available, but not accessible because they don't have a way to pay for it. So that's just a quick start to an example of why we need to think beyond just the production of food and need to think about the distribution and processing, the marketing, and beyond, and how climate change can affect that food system that we all participate in and really can't afford to take for granted. This figure is really similar, but I want to point out, I think, a valuable difference. This one, again, is showing examples of impacts of climate change on the food system. but it's organizing it by threats to food security. And so when we talk about food security, again, we're asking, is the food available? Is it accessible? Is it usable? And so it's not just about whether food can be produced, is it available? But once it's been produced, can people access it? Can they use it? And so this figure is just helping us again think creatively about, we've already talked through the people that were able to make it to the store, the food was available, but they couldn't access it because they couldn't pay for it. The last piece to that example would be, what about the people who didn't leave their homes? They didn't need to leave their homes. They had some food on hand, but their power went out as well, and they didn't have a backup source. And so their food at home may be going bad or spoiling, in which case the food was available, it was accessible, it wasn't usable anymore. So it just, again, gets us thinking a little more thoroughly about how resilient our food system may or may not be. One interesting little piece that we explore in our chapter is just, okay, after you've thought creatively about how resilient your local community's food system is or isn't, what are some of the approaches for building resilience? And I think there's two general thoughts here. One is the importance of local elements of a food system. And so we saw during COVID-19, right, that the local elements in our system, local farmers, mobile meat processors, our food assistance organizations, how critical they were during the COVID-19 pandemic to insulating our community against these bigger, much bigger scale, disruptions that started outside of the community and kind of came inward. And that can be true of climate events too, like the shipping route closures that we've seen recently, unfortunately, because of conflict around the world. So local elements of a food system have proven to be important in building resilience. But I also want to point out that trade-based systems are important, and these can be trade between two local communities, trade between states, trade between nations. These bigger trade-based elements are useful because they help fill gaps in the things that we can't grow locally. Or if there's a local disaster, we heard earlier about the false springs. So imagine there's a false spring in your local area that damages all the buds on that local fruit tree, or damages local vegetables. Trade is going to enable us to overcome those local shortages. And so it's not one or the other. I think it's as a community sitting down and talking through the strengths and weaknesses of these different elements of our food system. And they each have different strengths and different weaknesses that can complement each other if we think carefully through them. Those trade-offs might involve, again, strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, trade-offs. Those trade-offs might involve trade-offs between how many greenhouse gas emissions does the local-based food system produce versus a trade-based system. Maybe our local system actually sometimes can emit more greenhouse gas emissions, surprisingly, not always, but sometimes. But we also know that sometimes our local food systems provide ecosystem services, which you're seeing on the right, provide ecosystem services that wouldn't be there otherwise. And conversely, a trade-based system in some cases may emit fewer greenhouse gases, but maybe doesn't support as many ecosystem services or the types of ecosystem services that our local communities care about and value. So there are trade-offs. There are no silver bullets. What's important is for us to sit down in our communities and talk through what are our vulnerabilities, what are our sources of resilience, what trade-offs are important to us. And on that this is my last content slide. I want to give a nod to the third key message in our chapter, and that's about rural communities, again, who have incredible knowledge and experience managing our working lands, our farms, ranches, and forests. And again, they have some unique challenges and also some unique opportunities. And so this figure is helping us understand different community characteristics that can either increase our community's resilience or decrease it in the face of climate change. And so things like our community capital, how attached are we to our place? How are we attached to each other in our community? Communities that have greater attachment to place, greater engagement, either, with religious institutions or political institutions, they tend to be more resilient. Whereas the arrow that's pointing down, that's below the orange box, those are examples of communities that might struggle. They don't have as much community capital, and that makes them less resilient to climate change. So communities that struggle to attract volunteers and get engagement in preparedness planning, those are characteristics that are going to make them less resilient in the face of climate change. So you can go through each of these and do a little self-assessment with your community. How about our infrastructure situation? Do we have good quality housing and broadband internet access? These are things that tend to make our communities more resilient. Down in the social, the pink box at the bottom, education plays an important role in a community being resilient, access to health care. These are things that I think everyone on this call can help build and foster within our communities to become more resilient to these challenges and opportunities that we might face. With that, I'll stop, Erin, and turn it back over to you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danelle. That was great. As we've seen, climate, ag, water all exist in that nexus where we, we're able to pull it up into the food systems, thinking about rural community resilience, all very important topics here to sort of close us out. Hans has started the poll here. A couple of questions that we ask you that you can please answer. If you've got questions, we've got a few minutes here, just a few minutes. We'll end at the bottom of the hour. Just put your questions in the chat and we can ask any of the speakers questions here. We do have one that just came in, Danelle. Thinking about good references that report the adverse impacts of climate change on the national crops economics, or economics of the from a national crops perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that question. If you go to our chapter and find that statement about the 19% crop insurance losses, there is a citation there. Each of the chapters has a full reference list. And so if we run out of time, at the very least, you can go there. I know the Midwest chapter also has a different paper that they cite with some additional statistics. In the little bit of time we have left, I'll try and go and grab that reference. I know which one it is. I'll see if I can grab it and throw it in the chat box for you. But I also know, again, that there's a reference over in the Midwest chapter related to crop insurance as well. And hopefully those papers will lead you to the full body of crop insurance work related to climate change. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't see any questions. Yeah, so one couple of questions that we thought about, but one, maybe if any one of our authors want to join us. First, I've shared a slide here too. The North Central Climate Collaborative will be having an upcoming Regional Climate and Agricultural Conference in Peoria, Illinois here at the end of July, the 1st of August. So if you want some more information on that, please check that out for extension and technical advisors and others that you may be interested in registering for that. And look for a call for proposals and abstracts pretty soon as well. One thing that I'd be interested in, and maybe others would too, again, thinking about transparency of this chapter, if any of you want any one of our authors today want to talk about maybe one major gap in the research or knowledge that as author teams we sort of think should be addressed or should be addressed either in the near term based on our conversations or how our chapters developed over the course of 3 to 4 years.
Hey, Erin, I'll go ahead and mention there are two things I'm thinking about. One we actually discussed was climate migration and how populations may be shifting over time as a response. And that was something I think our conclusion was there's not enough evidence quite yet to really go heavy in that direction, but that's something that's certainly significant from an economic standpoint. If populations start shifting from one areas to others, you get into winners and losers things potentially. The other thing, and this is more of a personal angle, because I've stayed up with the literature, and I get a lot of questions about it, is what's going on with severe weather. That derecho we had in the Midwest that knocked down just acres and acres of corns and beans really focused people's attention on severe weather. And there's some papers that came out after our data cutoff time that are suggesting an increase. And that's something that, as the research continues in the next few years, that might ought to be a topic, not only for the Midwest, but I know the Northern Plains had a little bit on hail in their chapter. That might be something to more fully flush out.
Yeah, and we can broaden this question to include what Laura asked as well, emerging topics in the North Central region, or what we wish we knew more about as well. So others think about that question.
Yeah, I think for our region, and it sounded like Tanya mentioned something similar just north of us, is that the distribution of peer-reviewed literature between what we could find in Texas, which is a state that gets a lot of research funding, has a number of huge universities and USDA and other federal institutions. We could find a lot of research about Texas ag, water, almost any subject, you name it, and a lot less in Oklahoma and Kansas. And so there's inequity in what we're learning about what's happening in some of our states as compared to others. And then the other thing that I would mention is the migrant workforce, which is really important for much of our region. Not nearly as many studies about them as we would have liked to see.
So just a last reminder too, this is the last call for the poll questions. We're going to wrap those up really quick. Others have thoughts? Emerging
I think one of the things I would raise, and Ray, you mentioned this as well, with the increasing use of climate smart agriculture practices, but very little data so far on the effect of, or the impact of many of these practices, is in general really a lack of studies evaluating the success of climate adaptation and mitigation actions. And a lot of that is because a lot of things are new and emerging. Things are really context and locality specific. So it's not easy to do. It's not an easy thing to ask for, but clearly something we need to do more of.
Okay, we are at the bottom of the hour, so I don't want to take any more time. We'll give it another 15, 20 seconds if folks have a burning question. Laura also put the link to our climate conference information and registration in the chat as well. So for those that want to check that out, please do so. All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and close this out. This has been really fantastic. I really want to first thank all of the speakers, Ray, Tanya, Renee, and Danelle, for joining us today to talk about the National Climate Assessment, the latest round. Again, process for National Climate Assessment 6 is already underway as we look toward the next report, hopefully to cover some of these emerging topics that are coming on as well. Again, you can check out some more information about North Central Climate Collaborative online at the links provided. And until next time, we will have another. We just had our other webinar, and you can see that and past webinars at the northcentralclimate.org website. So we'll see you in a couple months at our next webinar. Until then, have a safe and probably warm early start to summer. We'll see you soon.